So welcome back, YouTube. In part 2, I'm going to talk basically about the system, the actual Atari 2600 itself, known as the Stella, which was the name of one of the engineers' bicycles. So they called it Stella while it was in development. It took a while to get that developed. Eventually they launched the product on September 11th, 1977, and it retailed for $199, which, adjusting in today's value, that comes out to $774. You think that, well, eventually it seemed to me that there was an Atari in every home. Like, everybody had an Atari. And there were other systems out there. It wasn't the first. They had a very successful machine which was called Pong, which was basically, you connected it to your TV through a very crude switch box, which you would manually switch this over to connect the antenna to watch terrestrial broadcast. And then when you wanted to play the game, you would turn the tuner channel to channel 3 and then switch this box over to accept the input from the system. And Pong was 2 spinner knobs, Pong, kind of little square ball bounces back and forth. And Pong was more affordable. As far as I know, Pong was a lot cheaper, but they sold a lot of those Pongs. I think the next system was a Magnavox Odyssey, and they had a few different Odysseys. There was a much larger version that had a keypad on it, and I believe that had a speech synthesis module as well, which would talk. They had a Pac-Man clone called KC Munchkin. It had very large joysticks. The Odyssey really looked more science fiction-y. It was almost more like something off of a Star Trek set. But the Atari 2600 was the one that took the cake. That was the one that had just an incredible amount of games. It was extremely popular. If you were under the age of 13, you were playing Atari, and a boy, pretty much. It was more of a male. I don't remember too many games that were marketed towards girls, which is still kind of the case today. It seems like most of those titles, and they do a little bit. But not to get into that misogynist can of worms, but yeah, that goes all the way back to September 11th, 1977. The Atari system shipped with a game called Combat, and it had a ridiculous amount of games on it. It was like, 73 games, but they were a lot of them were. There was basically only maybe 4 variations on that where the graphics were a little different, and that was an issue with a lot of the Atari titles. They would advertise it, it's got 65 games. Well, there are 65 slight variations on the exact same game. Adventure, the game that the series is basically about, had 3 games on it, and all 3 of those were different. The difficulty varied, and the world in which you existed got a little bigger with each one. They added more bad guys, so it was kind of, it was a legitimate thing. The difference between 1 and 2 was huge, and the difference between 2 and 3 was pretty huge as well. 3 was random, so you never really knew where any of the items in the game would be, where 2 was a set pattern of where you would find the useful items in the game. Now, Sears and Roebuck actually got in bed with Atari, and they sold their own version of the 2600, which was called the Sears Home Video Arcade. And I think they also released some games as well, which is another unique thing about Atari. They were more than, it wasn't just Atari who was releasing games for the system. And that was kind of a first. There was a company called, what were they called? Activision. And a lot of the original Atari programmers were unhappy. They weren't getting paid very much, and they had to sign non-disclosure agreements. So Atari didn't really pay those guys anything, and they worked them like dogs, from what I know. So a lot of those guys left and started their own company. And a lot of those Activision games were really good. Pitfall, probably their best known title, was like, that was a breath of fresh air to the system. I believe that's prolonged the crash for maybe a couple years. Now, there was another system. Mattel released the Intellivision, and they marketed that like if you were an idiot, you played Atari, but if you were better than everyone else, you played Intellivision. And they had a speech synthesis module for that as well. It's kind of a large, bulky thing. Had its own built-in speaker. So the speech did not emanate from the television speaker. The speech would come out of the built-in speaker in the speech module. And the speech module was pretty big. It was about half as large as the Intellivision. They released one title that worked with that speech simulator. It was called B-52 Bomber. And if you take a look at that, it's like
Mattel Electronics presents B-17 Bomb.
Like, it's not good. It wasn't cheap either. I think it was $70. I think it was $69 when it came out for the B-52. Now, we didn't have an Atari. You know, we were kind of late to that party. What ended up happening was my older brother kicked my younger brother and broke his leg. Shattered his leg in 3 places. My little brother was like 4, my older brother was 18, and me and my little brother were playing basketball. We beat my older brother and the 2 other boys. That was the teams. My 18-year-old brother and these 2 other kids that were around our age, around my age, and then versus me and my 4-year-old brother, and they won every day. They skunked us. And then one day we won. And I was high-fiving my little brother and, you know, we're kind of rubbing it in their face. And my older brother didn't have it, so he ended up kicking. Well, he got on top. He was choking me out. He pinned me, choked me out, and then my little brother jumped on his back. And he got up and kicked him and shattered his leg. So in penance for that, he had a job at the time. He was 18, so he bought him an Atari. And I'll tell you, that was like, I couldn't believe it. I mean, we had an Atari. At the time, those neighbor kids, they were the only ones that had one. And like, they invited me over to play it once. I got to play Adventure. And it like blew my mind. Like, we played a bunch of games. They had a lot. They had the Intellivision and the Atari. They had a ton of stuff. Their parents ended up getting a divorce, so I think maybe the dad was kind of buying them a lot of stuff at the time. They had a ton of stuff, and the best game by far was this Adventure. It just blew my mind. Now, typically, they saw how much I loved playing that, and I was never invited over to play again. They did call me a couple times and invite me over, and they said, come on in, the door's open. And my older brother was there with them. And they had wrist rockets, and they had they shut the power in the house off and one of them locked the door, and they like hunted me like it was a horror movie. They had like blowguns, and they were dressed up like ninjas, and it was like this stealth like James Bond thing. They had booby traps in the house. There was trip wires. And yeah, so that I was pretty happy when I ended up getting my own Atari 2600. Well, it was actually my little brother's, but I ended up playing it. And I did obtain an Adventure cartridge as soon as I could. Now, eventually the market became oversaturated. There was just tons of titles for the 2600. They ended up coming out with X-rated titles. They carried these at, there's a store called Spencer Gifts, which was at the mall, where they had some adultish type stuff there. It was a novelty store. They had black lights and psychedelic type of lights and goofy stuff. And then they had like an adult section with like dirty playing cards and silly stuff like that. And they did also, behind the counter, they sold these pornographic X-rated Atari games. One of these games was called Custer's Revenge, in which this game you play as General Custer, who is a naked man with a cowboy hat who has to navigate his way across a cactus field where there's arrows being shot at him. And on the other side of the field is a Native American woman, crudely portrayed in 8-bit glory of square genitalia, chained to a post, and then when you reach the squad, you rape her. So there was a huge outcry about this Custer's Revenge. There were other X-rated games, which I have played all of those games. We heard about that stuff going on. We were like, I mean, this is what I was into. Atari was like, it was the shit. And we had read about this stuff. I don't think I ever saw any of that. Maybe I might have seen it for sale at Spencer's, but nobody had. You had to be 21 to buy them. So years later, when emulation came out, that was like the first thing we would do is like, I gotta see Custer's Revenge, you know? And I mean, it's like, if you've never seen them, it's one of the most hilarious. It's not erotic. Like, it's not, I mean, it's 8-bit, it's Atari. So there's no way you're gonna get worked up over it. What it is it's hilarious. I mean, when I eventually found that stuff, I contacted one of my buddies that I was friends with at the time, and I had him over and I showed him this stuff, and we could not stop laughing. It was hilarious. They do have, there's like Cat House and some other titles I'm not even gonna say because they're disgusting, but I do remember one of the games being a Pac-Man clone, and there are cutscenes in that game that are very pornographic. I mean, it's very distasteful, but there was a huge outcry about that. I think it actually went to court, and then what happened was, I think in '83, they released a game called E.T. the Extraterrestrial after the movie. They bought the rights from Spielberg, and they paid a lot of money for that, and they rushed the developer. He had basically 3 weeks to code the game, and it took a long time to code a good game because the memory constraints of these cartridges was like 40 kilobyte. It was nothing. So you really had to write, you had to be like a wizard master at coding to condense the code to get it to fit on what the medium was. So the game came out and it was awful. I mean, it was really bad, and they spent a lot of money on advertising. They made the ads for the game look like the movie. They were really well produced, and they had the real E.T. in the ads, you know. And so pretty much every kid asked for that cartridge for Christmas. Normally you'd pay about between $20 and $30, and that was a lot of money back then for an Atari cartridge. And that title was $55. And everyone went out and they had to buy that for their kid, and then it was awful. It was like offensively bad. It was like the worst Atari title out of all of them. It was horrible. So the reality of that, it's not a legend. It was for a while. A lot of people didn't believe this story, but they went and buried thousands of those ET cartridges in a hole in the desert. They couldn't get rid of them, and they didn't know what to do with them, so they literally dug a hole in the desert and buried them. Because that game buried the business. That was the great video game crash, where the bottom dropped out of that market and it all went dead. And it was because of E.T. Racist faces. Not good. So recently, some guys went out to the desert, actually located that, and they did a documentary where they dug down and they found the missing, the hidden, the secret graveyard of the Atari 2600 ET cartridges. So how cool is that? Now, there is emulator software you can get. Stella is one of the names of the software. So you can download this and install that in your computer. You can download a package of all of the games, or individually, depending on where you go. If you go to the more illegal type sites, they'll have a complete package. If you just go online in regular, normal fashion, you'll get one by one. But you can go ahead and install that and play these games and enjoy them without having a hardware system. Now, I have a collection here. I think I have around 55, maybe 56, something around there, cartridges. I have all the controllers, multiple sets, paddles, NE 500 controllers, joysticks, custom joysticks. I do not have the math controller or the keypads. I don't have those. I may have one. And then I have something, I've got, a heavy sixer, a couple of wood grains, a Darth Vader, and 2 juniors. The junior is a smaller version. And I've got some of those that are modded out for composite output. Because, like I said, it had that weird box that you would hook up to your antenna. Doesn't have RCA style connectors for composite video, which is what is found on like a VCR or a more modern system. They have those type of inputs, but you can very easily modify your Atari. Just maybe a couple resistors, I think, or one resistor, and you cut in the jacks and then you add that resistor, and those are your audio video ports, so it works pretty well. I also have something called a StarPad Supercharger. This could be a video on its own. I apologize for the length of this. The StarPad Supercharger is a very cool thing. It came out towards the end of the shelf life of the Atari system, but the idea was, it was a cassette-based system where the ROM cartridges for the Atari was what costed some money. In order to manufacture those, each one was a pretty hefty price tag. So they figured out that if they could make a single cartridge, and then that would connect to a cassette recorder, they could sell you the copies of the games on a cassette. And that would save them all of their money, and they could pass the savings on to you. So you would buy the StarPad Supercharger, would come with one game on tape, which was a great game. And then you would have that, and then additional titles would be purchased from them in cassette form, and they would only cost them 50 cents to buy the cassette. So you could get these cartridges for, $10, $15, considerable savings. Well, it wasn't a successful product, but later on, people figured out they could convert the normal ROM files to audio files very easily, and then you could have all of the Atari games burnt to a CD. So you'd have like a Atari, like a Sony Discman, like a little portable CD player, and you'd have this disc, and it would hold, 199. So that's the maximum amount of tracks that you could put on a CD. You'd have 100 Atari games on one CD. So I have that. I have a StarPad Supercharger. I purchased that and modified it. There's a memory modification that you do. Add a switch to it for the different games. Some have different memory requirements. So you do that mod. And then I have a 4 CD set, excuse me, with 400. I have all of them. All the Atari games, including all of the X-rated video games for the 2600. So that's really cool. That was what I was running. You ever notice I have some videos of me on my pedal boat? We had a little color monitor with the Atari 2600 Junior with a supercharger, so we were able to play video games on the boat. Mind you, they were just Atari, but hey, that's what I'm into. So it was pretty cool playing River Raid on a river. Very cool, very cool. So the StarPad Supercharger, probably still available. If you look around, you'll probably be able to find that. So the Atari 2600 was the system that started the entire revolution of home gaming. It is a fantastic system, although very limited. But some of those games are really fun. There's some really fun titles. Raiders of the Lost Ark, and Adventure. Adventure is the king of the Atari games. It really is. So we're going to talk more about that in the next video.